to do is we're going to let the big homie Flame talk. We're going to listen to him, and then we're going to respond, and we're going to see where the conversation goes. Let's listen to the conversation. Now, I should say I'm going to start this at about 9 minutes and 30 seconds. I really encourage you to go watch the whole thing for yourself. Watch the whole thing in context, because even before this, they make some very interesting points and some things that I can respect and agree with. But this is where I think kind of the meat of the conversation goes. And so let's take a listen.
Yeah. I call it movement. I think of, for example, when a lot of this, at least in our generation, really hit the fan with Trayvon Martin and then Mike Brown, right? Mm-hmm. So that's sort of like probably the marker of when the church started to think a little deeper about these things, right?
Yeah.
Because really from the civil rights movement to right up to Trayvon,
yeah,
the church hadn't really talked much about social justice or social injustice. It was pretty much, if you were in a prosperity-driven church, you were talking about prosperity. If you were in a reform-driven church, you were talking about doctrines of grace and so on and so forth. But then this social conversation.
Well, there were black liberation.
Right. So there were churches then but it was pockets. It wasn't like a big conversation.
Of course. Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? So I'm just saying, in everybody's respective corners, they were sort of
talking about
that. So we're just going to pause it right there, because I think this deserves some exploration. So just to kind of catch you up, obviously, he's talking about, now we're getting into the social justice aspect and how the church dealt with issues of social justice, and how that manifested, once again, in different cultural contexts. So, obviously, Calvinism, white evangelical churches, was where that idea and that doctrine is prevalent. But this is the first problem that I had right away with kind of the way that this conversation went, because here Flame kind of, uses as a marker, and I think appropriately so. He mentions Trayvon Martin, which had happened, maybe a year or so before the Michael Brown situation. But then he mentions Michael Brown and Ferguson, and I have to say that this to me is disappointing, because he kind of mentions it as kind of like this, well, with no further explanation, no caveats, like, hey, the whole Michael Brown situation and Ferguson was an example of a situation that needed to be responded to with, a cry for social justice. Now, I use the Michael Brown situation like a litmus test, to be quite frank. Whenever someone says the Michael Brown situation is an example of social injustice, I'm just keeping it all the way 100. I immediately know that this person may not be well informed. They might be talking about these things, but in a way where they just lack the basic knowledge to really have a conversation that is meaningful. What's really more kind of disappointing about this particular reference from Flame is because Flame is from St. Louis, right? And Ferguson, Missouri is basically, that's the same community. Now, I don't know the exact geography of St. Louis and Ferguson, Missouri, whether that's like a suburb or whether it's down the street. Like, I live in Omaha, Nebraska, and there's a town called Bellevue that's 25 minutes away, and whatever. I don't know how close they are, but that's his community. And so I really almost expect him to be more informed than the average person about this. And here he mentions it like it was an example of social injustice. And so you'll see why this is important to me here in a moment. But I want to let's just talk about the Michael Brown situation just for a moment. I want to read you an article that is in the Washington Post. You can't read all the Washington Post articles for free. Sometimes you have to have a description. But here's one that I think kind of says everything we need to know. It says, "Hands up, don't shoot did not happen in Ferguson." That's an interesting headline, right? Let's read it. This phrase became a rallying cry for Ferguson residents who took to the streets to protest the fatal shooting of black 18-year-old by a white police officer, Darren Wilson. Witness accounts spread after the shooting that Brown had his hands raised in surrender, mouthing the words, "Don't shoot," as his last words before being shot execution style. The gesture of raised hands becomes a symbol of outrage over mistreatment of unarmed black youth by police. That narrative was called into question when St. Louis County grand jury could not confirm those testimonies, and a recently released Department of Justice investigation report concluded the same. Yet the gesture continues to be used today. Here's the critical point. So we want to set the record straight on the DOJ's findings, especially after the Washington Post opinion writer Jonathan Capehart wrote that it was built on a lie. From time to time, we retroactively check statements as new information becomes available, and in this case, the Justice Department has concluded that Wilson acted out of self-defense and was justified in killing Brown. Now, for more context, this is the Washington Post, okay? This isn't Fox News or whatever sort of caricature of right-wing news sources that want to dismiss all the racism as if it's just regular and necessary. This is the Washington Post. In fact, the Washington Post is actually a news source that actually compiles, and they actually have an ongoing database where they document every police shooting of an unarmed person, particularly unarmed black people, but an unarmed person, in an effort to kind of try to demonstrate the scope of the problem. So they're big on the social justice thing, on the unarmed black men being shot thing. They are not. This is not whatever right-wing news source you think is racist. They're saying unequivocally that the hands up, don't shoot thing was a lie. And here's the thing about this. Hands up, don't shoot. I've known that this was a lie for years, right? Hands up, don't shoot. That happened in 2014. We're 2021. And this podcast that Flame released, I'm spending a lot of time on this because I want you to understand why this is important. This is 2021, and Flame is still using this as an example of social injustice. And this is the reason why we cannot come to a good, a unified vision of what it means to pursue justice. It's because we have people who consistently use false information and false narratives as examples of injustice, and then when people don't respond to them in the way that they hope, as we'll see later in the video, now all of a sudden the persons who are not responding that way, they're responding with a lack of compassion and being calloused. So this is the first and most critical error, and I think it sets the tone for me, and this is where it started to change for me as I listened to this video. And then I listened to some of the other things that they say, and I can see right away that all of the rhetoric that tends to permeate our speech and starts to creep in and take on sort of Christian forms, it starts to get us going down the wrong path. So